Good morning. Welcome to the Korean Language and Literature Department at Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, Romania. I am pleased to introduce to you a very special guest, Dr. Andreas Schirmer. Dr. Schirmer is Assistant Professor of Korean Studies at the Department of East Asian Studies at the Palacký University in Olomouc, the Czech Republic. Previously, he has taught for many years at the University of Vienna, contributing to the development of Korean studies in Austria. He is also the founder and coordinator of a large CPUS network of Koreanists in Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. Schirmer holds a PhD in modern German literature from the University of Vienna and has also completed a PhD program in Korean language and literature at Seoul National University. He has done extensive research on contemporary Korean literature, as well as a series of German translations of Korean literature. His current research relates to the representation of matters of public debate in contemporary Korean literature, to translation studies, and to historical cases of interaction between Koreans and Central Europeans. Today, Dr. Schirmer will be presenting a lecture entitled Issues of Contemporary South Korean Society Mirrored in Fiction. The lecture is supported by a special funding program of the AXE, the Association for Korean Studies in Europe, and the Korea Foundation. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Andreas Schirmer and also invite the students attending the lecture to ask questions at the end of the lecture. Thank you. Professor Schirmer, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thank you, Professor Shinkanyan, for inviting me to Cluj, a place that I am very fond of and that I have in my heart from many visits there already. And well, I might start by involving you, and it will be a little, well, not a game, maybe it's exaggerated, but it will hopefully give you a little, very little kick. And do you see my screen? Aha, since I have now shared my screen, just a moment. Since I have shared my screen, I think I cannot type into the chat. So there is one sentence and you have to complete this sentence. This is a task. Oh, sorry. No. I don't have, just a moment. Okay. Screen is not shared, right? But you are moved.
Right. Right.
Okay. Just a moment. Here you are. So what you learn from reading is, please do not type right away. So what you learn from reading is, and now you complete by one word, not more. Please, well, think it over for half a minute, and then we will have a countdown, and you type in the word that comes to your mind, and the solution will come at the end of this class or of this little lecture.
Can you share the message with us on the chat?
You don't see it. I wrote it to everybody.
Yes,
Zoom,
but please maybe press enter.
So let me check, for example, Stefania Verdes. Don't you see my chat message? Okay. Very sorry. Now you see it, right?
Yes.
Pardon.
So the question is what you learn from reading is, and we have to ponder on this, right?
you ponder on this for, well, half a minute. And please, keep in mind, it's only one word. And you write it not right now, but after a countdown all at once. So in order that you don't influence yourself mutually. Only one word. Okay, and that's also a nice way how to keep, well, track of everybody who attends and participates. For the countdown, well, I'd make it short, just from 5 to 0. Are you ready? Thank you. Okay. What you learn from reading is, countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, very nice answers. So I hope this will keep you going to the end of this class, of this lecture, because you are curious about the solution. Well, after this little childish game, well, I hope hopefully not too childish, I will share again my screen. And just a moment. Yeah, and try some glimpses on issues of contemporary South Korean society mirrored in fiction. Well, this sounds in fact as if I would now talk a lot about the issues themselves, the issues per se. So in a way, this title might be misleading, and you will learn in which way. Well, if you browse through contemporary Korean literature and K-lit even, well, you will find out that much of it is promoted by pointing to these literatures, these novels, these short stories, treatment of contemporary issues like mothers and daughters, or working people, or, well, again, women, of, well, all kinds of issues like, well, what are the issues of contemporary Korea? What are the issues that are, well, comprised under the label Hell Joseon, for example? I'm sure that some issues would come immediately to your mind, and I won't anticipate too much of it. Well, there is this nice, there is this view that literature, in fact, gives you a privileged insight into issues. So, to quote this brilliant dissertation, A New Pedigree, Women and Women's Reading in Korea, there is, well, it's debatable whether this is really peculiar for Korea or a characteristic of Korea, but there is this attitude that, in fact, literature reveals you even more about reality than other sources. So, and you could argue that this is related to Korea's history, So to censorship, to, well, a dictatorship, which created, as is said here, a special pact between readers and writers, a desire to tell the truth and an expectation to hear the real story, even in the form of fictional novels and lyrical poetry. Literary works provided a channel for the unofficial true story or history. So in this view, Korean literature of, say, the 70s would manage to tell you about the reality of, well, workers' exploitation, for example, by this brutal dictatorship for development, while you would not hear that much about it via, well, from reading newspapers. At the same time, you know, I always feel a little bit awkward or torn when trying to sell literature, you know, as a teacher, by pointing out its merits in regard to, well, representing reality, because it conflicts with, well, with one thing that might be the opposite thereof, literarity. So if you are really in literature, well, I mean, there are people who only care, in fact, about the representation, to put it simple, and there are people who care about the literariness. Maybe I anticipated already too much of what I will talk about. Roman Rapp Jakobson, this brilliant person who has lived in Prague, says literary studies are focused not on literature, but on literacity, or on literariness. And this is the specific quality that distinguishes literature from texts with the primary function of communication. What does this mean? I'm bound here to monologue a bit. So I realize when talking that I all the time feel prompted to ask, and then I have to, call myself back. So what does this mean, this literariness? What is literary? According to Terry Eagleton, who has written some very nice and, well, some very nice seminal books on what literature is. According to him, literary is a work which is fictional, or a work that yields significant insight into human experience as opposed to reporting empirical truth. Or literary is a work that uses language in a peculiarly heightened, figurative, or self-conscious way. Or literary is a work that is not practical in the sense that shopping lists are. Or literary is a work that is highly valued as a piece of writing, which is then a little bit of a, well, circular thing. And then again, at this moment, of course, would feel natural for me to, to ask you, what would you opt for? What would be your choice? But let's jump over this. Okay. So I find especially relevant for my talk here this definition that literatures yield significant insight into human experience as opposed to reporting empirical truth. Let's keep this in mind. Because, yeah, maybe I will now make a little jump. Because in fact, if you look at how, I will go back, don't worry, at how literature is promoted or sold, you will find out that quite often literature is sold with the argument that it tells you something about more or less empirical truth. And yeah, if you just browse through the weekend's feuilleton, in many cases, the strong point of a book that the reviewer recommends to you is claimed to be, well, its value as representing real world. So as if there would be no higher praise for a piece of literature than confirming what we actually know from newspapers, from history books, from sociology. Well, this is just an arbitrary example. So this novel foreshadows the Nigerian coups, and shows the color and vivacity as well as the violence and corruption of a society making its own way between the two worlds. Yeah, so there is this this strand of, well, this strand of thinking that literature can be a source telling you about reality. And there are people in sociology, in all fields, who actually exploit literature that way, fiction and social reality. Yeah, and I'm actually very glad, because that's a way how to work with literature as a teacher while also satisfying the need to teach about reality in Korea, about, well, contemporary society, about historical developments, of course. And, well, there are sociologists like these who became famous actually with this article, who would even claim that literature has a significant advantage over nonfiction, or fiction has an advantage over nonfiction in terms of, well, telling you, of providing you knowledge, authoritative knowledge even, telling you about society. So they say that not only are certain works of fiction better than academic or policy research in representing central issues relating to development, but they also frequently reach a wider audience. Well, of course. Maybe it should be the other way around. So they are better than academic or policy research in representing central issues relating to development. Well, in that case, you have to bear in mind it's about, well, about sociologists who deal with development issues. So you could actually replace development by, well, social issues. Yeah. And moreover, the line between fact and fiction is a very fine one, and there can be significant advantages. Yeah, we had this. So this was very well received and was reported in many, well, quality papers all over the world. Real world issues, yeah, there are, so the Guardian reports about this article saying that the authors insist that our understanding of real world issues grows out of a series of stories. And yeah, there are others in the same vein, arguing in the same vein, and well, recommending literature as a source for a better holistic understanding of living conditions. So literature in this view makes people, readers, students, see vividly how social processes affect people's lives, and they make them explore the mindset and motivations, or the moral or not, of people living under different circumstances from today or elsewhere, and gain an appreciation of the difficulty of analyzing and interpreting one's own social and political reality. Well, I pointed to this to this article and others from sociology. In fact, it's, you might say, it's not even new. I mean, all the time, well, since later the study of literature is a subject, academic subject. People have well, mind literature as a mirror of, I admit these are all German, I realize now, but Spiegel means mirror, so literature as a mirror. Scholars have mind literature for, well, for elements that mirror social reality. And it's true, literature is often a mirror of real conditions. But what is often forgotten then is that it's not only literature that mirrors. So you, anyway, even if you only read, well, nonfiction, if you only read newspapers, you do not have a direct view on the real conditions. You have mirrors and lenses all the time. You never have the clear window. You might say, okay, the unemployment statistics are a different kind of mirror. They are more reliable than whatever a novel can tell you about unemployment. But at the same time, the truth of unemployment is no number. And in the end, it always matters what the meaning of numbers is. So statistics is not reality itself. And statistics only mirror reality in a way, or abstract reality. They are a lens, they are not a crystal clear window. So for example, real joblessness is clearly not equivalent to any number. And as soon as we ask what joblessness means, we are in the sphere of interpretations already. And this is where literature actually has its advantages. So in Asian studies, looking at conditions as they are mirrored in the minds of people is in fact often the more promising object of study. So, well, if you are interested in unemployment, of course, you can approach it that way, that you look at statistics. They are done by big institutes. You, well, you normally already have the interpretations as well, because, well, there are those institutes that publish statistics just as they are, naked, but as soon as the statistics come out, there are people who also present an interpretation thereof. So in fact, as well, as a student who wants to write a thesis, you might be quite at a loss what to do, whether there is anything left to do. But if you choose a novel that deals with unemployment, you have something to do. Well, that's a little bit maybe a side story of it. It's a little wisdom, just and it explains maybe why I much prefer theses that have literature as their primary source, because, well, that's how you can actually do something normally. So it's very, very hard to do something if you would try this direttissima approach at the issue. Okay. So looking at conditions as they are mirrored in the minds of people is often the more promising object of study. And it's often a very common misunderstanding that this is not reliable. So the minds of people might make an elephant of a mouse or a mouse of an elephant, but it's nonetheless, well, a subject, a possible subject, and it's the one that very often, well, gives you some leeway to do something. Okay, now I already have arrived at my but. So I'm meandering, maybe you have realized between these two, just in the last, let me see, maybe 10 minutes, I argued, or I presented you arguments, well, arguments in favor of using literature as a source of authoritative knowledge about reality. Well, what is the but again? As for the but, I would go back to where I started, and as I have jumped over a few slides, I will go back there. So the but is, well, this would be part of this, but literature is invention, fiction is fiction. To call a story a true story is an insult to both truth and art. So, well, if literature would be a source of authoritative knowledge on reality, you would think, oh, there must be a truth of the story, or there must be a truth in this novel that you can, well, that is the equivalent of a true story, but that can be contested. So fiction is fiction. This insistence, why? Well, first of all, it's always crucial that you never forget this, this fallacy, or anyway, this principle of fictionality. The writer who invented Münchhausen, I'm not sure whether this character, well, but there is a famous animation. I suppose you are familiar with this character who is, well, the exemplary liar, pulling out himself on his own hair from a swamp, riding on a cannonball out of Constantinople, etc. So the writer who invented Münchhausen is not a liar, and well, also the statements by this protagonist are just poetic acts. Huh? So if you deal with literature, you never can skip this caveat or this fictionality clause. And so this somehow is at odds with engaged literature, this literature of commitment, which, well, means a literature that is responsible to society. You have to consider that, well, this famous literature engagée is also a reaction to another position, to, well, to this art for art's sake position. And, well, Sartre is the famous protagonist there of criticizing Marcel Proust and also Gustave Flaubert, and defending a literature that would fight for, well, all kinds of improvement of society. Yeah, should literature talk to a public? And should literature provide interventions on public discourse? That's a formula that I find often when literature is recommended. Should literature speak to society? There is this position that says literature is about the self. So, like this, ultimately we read in order to strengthen the self and to learn its authentic interests. The pleasures of reading are selfish rather than social. I'm wary of any arguments whatsoever that connect the pleasures of solitary reading to the public good. Okay, maybe I realize now that I should go from these matters of principle to, well, to something beyond this, to something more concrete. And yeah, 50 minutes are passed too quickly. If you're talking, you maybe have realized that time passes much quicker for a speaker than for a listener. That's a wisdom. And so I realized that I should now really go to my few examples, and they stem from this book, Castera, by Bang Mingyu. You see him here in his youth. And, well, this is my translation thereof with a different title from a different story. So it's different stories. This is the author, a bit older. And Castera is a sponge cake. So this sponge cake is here in this refrigerator, and the story of the sponge cake of Castera is the first story here. Well, I have to connect this. Now I go back to the idea that literature nonetheless tells us a lot about social issues, and even so, I really am quite a fan of this idea that literature is catering to the self, etc. At the same time, I'm pluralistic enough to acknowledge the value of literature as a source of knowledge about society. But maybe we can somehow connect things and say that literature, via its literariness, is even able to, to provide us even more. In this case, it's about providing us formulas and really, well, really memorable formulas, really memorable, well, icons of social reality. And so this icon here is the sponge cake or the refrigerator. Yeah, refrigerator 냉장고. In fact, it's a 고장난 냉장고. Well, a refrigerator that is not working, that is broken. And yeah, 냉전. You certainly know that 냉전 is the Cold War. So all these meanings play a little bit into it. The story of castera, of the sponge cake in this 고장난 냉장고 is about a poor student who buys a second-hand refrigerator, and in the end he ends up putting all his problems and all kinds of things that are dear to him as well, both into the refrigerator. There is this old joke, how do you get an elephant into the fridge? You open the door, you put the elephant in, you close the door. Done. And by this same, well, ridiculous principle, our hero in this story, Castera, is putting into the fridge what he puts in his father, who is, well, bankrupt. He puts in his favorite books. He puts in his, well, his university, the whole of China, the USA. Well, yeah, what does this mean? He puts in all kinds of things that bother him, but he also puts in things that are precious in his view. So he keeps them in the refrigerator as a kind of, well, in order not to decide, or in order, yeah, to keep things undecided, floating midway. And well, the story tells us a lot about living conditions of the student. You know, you might, not sure, do they sell a lot of used fridges, second-hand fridges in Romania? Well, in Korea it's done, and it tells us something about living conditions. But more importantly, well, it is a metaphor, or it is an icon for, well, the living conditions of a student who really lives on the edges, on small money, and with parents who actually cannot support him, and the student feels overwhelmed by, well, also the political realities. He puts the US in the fridge because he is anti-American, and and in the end, it's a very strong, well, it's a very strong image for a person in, formative years in Korea, who just tries to, well, just tries to get into the new millennium, because this story plays at the end of the last millennium, end of the 90s. And yeah, it's so ridiculous, but at the same time hilarious. Not sure whether I got this across, but it's not the only story about a poor student. There is another poor student who is the protagonist of Yakult achima. So you have here the Yakult achima, or Yakult. Anyway, it's profession that I think originated in Japan. So they have the Yakult ladies as well, and they have this peculiar yellow driving around. These days, not like this, but these days they have scooters, very nice scooters, and they would drive up, those hill slums even with their yogurt, but also serving it to, also entering the big skyscrapers, the posh skyscrapers with the nice large bureaus of Korean companies, and bringing you your fresh yogurt every day. And the yogurt achuma, or Yakult achuma, actually does not play a big role there, but there is a student who suffers from constipation. So he cannot do his, what's a nice word for it? He cannot defecate, sorry to say, and that goes on for like up to 2 weeks, or just a moment, no, even longer. So it's actually a very absurdly long time, and he connects with other people who have the same condition. The story plays like in the early, this, I have to tell you, this anthology was published first in 2005, and it's really, really very surprising, I'd say, that everything that is depicted is just remain just the same. And there are also things like, that's not crucial here, but there are things like cafes, internet cafes, where people exchange their opinions, and you can see that Koreans practice this at the like 17 years ago, just like we would do now. I mean, it's a side story. Anyway, what is more important is that this precarious jobs, this really miserable condition of people who have an irregular job, or who are irregular workers, that this just has remained the same. So you might know that the current president based his campaign on raising the minimum income for irregular workers. And yeah, irregular workers are really a big issue in Korea. And here, many irregular workers are shown as suffering from constipation because of their stress, and because of humiliation, and because of, this work culture, this exploitative work culture of Korea. So here we have a Domi working in a parking lot, and why does he suffer from constipation? He has to show people with some movements by his hands. Every customer he has to point the way, even so there is a nice flash, so would actually not be needed. But since the work of such an irregular worker is cheap, the workforce is cheap, Koreans do this. And well, there is this brilliant icon or metaphor of the dodo who became extinct. Maybe you know the story of the dodo on Mauritius, who was like trusting and who was then, well, eaten up by the Portuguese who came to Mauritius because it was such an easy prey. And the totally apocryph, the totally, absurd and totally invented anecdote of Bang Ming-yu here is that the dodo also suffered from constipation because of all this stress. And the dodo thus, ended up by hiding his excrements because the Portuguese would chase him by following. As hunters do, by following the excrements of the animal that they are chasing. And so the dodo resorted to all these strategies that are absurdly described in detail with some fantasy Portuguese, French terms by Bang Ming-yu, eating up excrements, defecating underwater, mixing their own excrements into the excrements of other animals, or defecating only in very, very small tranches, so that the excrement is hard to detect. And all this becomes like the icon of the plight of Korean, of Korean working people, and especially of the Pi Chongyuchik, of the irregular workers. And I realized that I have to go to the end, but let me, I think it's only 2 or 3 stories that I will shortly refer to as well, and then try to wrap it up. There is this story about a student who finished college, a 2 years education, and he sends out 77 applications, does not land a job, and ends up finally by chance as a worker for an amusement park, which is in fact a very miserable amusement park that lives mostly from renting duck boats to actually rather poor people, very on the margins of the big town, so very much on the outskirts and not on a real lake, but on an artificial lake created by a dam. And there is again something that is Gojangnan, which is the Dudoji Chapki game machine. And the Dudoji Chapki game, here again would be a point where I would normally ask you, has anybody ever played it? Does it exist in Romania? But you have Dudoji in Romania, you have moles, don't you? And maybe you have those farmers who would also not like the moles because, well, in spring they are building, they're enlarging their dwellings, and then they are in the view of the farmers, wasting the field, the grass fields, the grass. Sorry, not the. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's so hard to monologue all the time. Please, just a moment. Sasha, Michaela, are you familiar with the mole matter? Are you aware, or is there anybody from a farm? No. No, but I'm from a farm, right? Yes,
Yeah.
please. Who's talking?
I said, that was your question, right? What a millimeter is.
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah, I've played once with one, it was very tiring.
Sorry, the audio here is really very bad. Do you hear me clearly?
Yes, I hear it clearly.
Okay, because you sound as if it would be transmitted from the moon.
Sorry, I have problems with my laptop.
Aha, okay, so it might not be representative. Yeah, thank you nonetheless. Sorry, I did not get well what you said. What's the problem with the moles in you in the eyes of farmers?
They damage the crops.
They damage the crops. Well, I think
By making the holes like.
yeah, in my understanding, it's rather about the grass plains. So there would be, yeah. What do they do? How do they damage? Hello.
Um, they sometimes eat the roots of some plants,
Okay.
and they when you make like your garden, you make like you put the plants in order, but if the mole comes, you find like random holes,
Okay.
and it all gets like messed up.
Okay, I have to verify whether they really eat roots. In my knowledge, yeah, or in fact, even my own father, yeah, did not like moles because, well, when they built their channels, yeah, and their uh, their subterranean or their, just a moment, subways, so to say. They shove the earth with their big legs or hands or whatever. They shove it outside, and then there are hills. And on these fresh hills, of course, there is no grass, and they are very diligent. So they make lots of these hills, and you end up having no grass. Okay, and that's why in former times they would chase even the moles, and they would like make clothes from it. Yeah, so we have those old folk tales with the princess and her, yeah, yeah, even the coat. I know a folk tale where the princess or so wears a coat from moles. Imagine how many moles does it take, even if it's a small princess. Okay, anyway. The Koreans, I think they also did not like moles. So they have created this game where you just hit the mole on the head as soon as it sticks out its head. That's the Dudachi Chapki. In fact, yeah, chapta rather means like catch, but you don't catch it, you just hit it on the head and then it goes down. And you, well, you get punished when you overlook a mole. So when he managed to stick out its head and withdraw it without you having hit him, it's a minus for you, and you get the maximum points, I think, if you manage really to hit every mole that dare to stick out its head. Okay, and it's very popular. And well, that's also a metaphor in this story for the hero. So he feels like a mole who tries out to stick its head, but gets gets slapped on his head immediately, like sending out an application, hopeful, so being full of hope, sticking out the head and getting slapped. You don't make it. And I think that's also a nice, very nice formula or icon, yeah, of, well, hardships of the unforgivingness of Korean society. Okay. And then, well, maybe I will skip this. You might be also familiar with the Kushi one. Oh, Angel Bianca, have you even lived in a Kushi one? But you know, do you know it from Korea or from Japan?
From Korea. It was a project in our class that has this subject.
Oh, okay. How was this constructed? You had to build your own Koshibon room at home and live there? No? What was it, may I ask?
It was just a presentation about this room.
About this room. So what is the concept that you got?
It is a room for students. Very, very small, and you can sleep well or take a bath very well. So it's not that convenable for students to live there, but there are no other choices.
Yeah. Okay. Are only students using these?
I'm not that sure, but that's all I remember.
Yeah, it said that originally it was only used by Gushi students or Gushi candidates. Do you remember what the Gushi is? It's a Shihom, like a state exam, the one that by which you bypass, so to say, university education. And well, originally it catered to these, but in fact, yeah, it evolved into a cheap accommodation for almost everybody, from the bar lady to the manual worker. And there is one story in this anthology, Castera, that dwells on the life of a student who, well, has so meager means that he also resorts to a koshibon because everything else is too expensive. So these koshibon with these 2 square meters or so are affordable. Often they don't even have a window. The walls are very, well, are next to nothing. So you hear everything. There is an extensive episode on it with the protagonist trying to keep his, well, to refrain from farting. Well, you may have realized that Koreans like a lot all kinds of scatological and things, but even that, I mean, it's not trivial. So now I realize that even that would be worth talking about, because he compares his farts to fish and to tropical fish and to sharks and whatever. That's very hilarious. But then, and now the picture is missing. The picture that I wanted. So I have to describe it. There is one, and this will be the last icon that I present here. It's an ear on a mouse, on a labor rat, and Pang Mingyu compares his stay in the Squishy with the imaginary organ in the ear. Okay, but maybe it will be too much now. What I wanted to say is, I'm not sure whether I got it across, but we have a bit of time for questions. I'm very sorry that I actually used more time than I was assigned to. What I wanted to get across is that this literature here manages to present formula for social reality that is somehow, well, it is of course imagination, but these formulas condense insights, or if you want to paraphrase what the story says, you will see that there is some surplus of this story in relation to, well, the simple factual matter of, let's say, unemployment, precarious jobs, bad working conditions, etc. And so this surplus is what makes literature, well, among others, what makes literature so much worth reading. And, well, reading. What you learn from reading is, are you still interested in the solution? I'm afraid that I sort of suffocated you. Just a moment. I want to go to your questions, to your answers. A lesson, mentality, everything, humanity, ways of thinking, life story. And what else? Just a moment, the chat is disappearing all the time. Expanding. So nobody has, I think, the correct solution. I mean, yours is not, your solutions or your answers are not wrong, of course, but, well, what you learn from reading is reading. That's an aphorism by Peter Handke, my favorite author. And, well, what does this tell? Reading is about reading books, write about other books, if you are intent on just learning from books about, so to say, the outside world, outside of literature, it's not, well, can say it's wrong, but it should not be all. And I think saying that what you can learn from reading is really a very good aphorism in that way that it's a non-trivial wisdom and a precious wisdom. So you hone your sensitivity, your skills in appreciating the build-up, the architecture of sentences by reading. You take literature serious by appreciating its literariness. That's, in fact, the best way of reading, in my view. Okay. Sorry, I hate monologuing, but somehow I ended up with it. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for your lecture. Now it's the students' turn to ask questions if they have any.
Yeah, because otherwise I have to ask you. So please, somebody sacrifice yourself.
You were talking about Castera, Pag Mingyu's story. Do you know if it was translated into English?
There are various stories, not the whole anthology, but there were stories translated, which appeared in journals, or I think one appeared in Azalea, which is a very nice journal for literature that publishes translations, and in well, some others, Words Without Borders, I think. So there are like 5 or even 6 stories that are translated. I always, I translated this for a very long time. I now have translated a novel by Hwang Sok-kyung within more or less 4 months. But I translated Bang Ming-kyu's Castera for 10 years. I mean, of course, not full time, but it's really a much bigger challenge in a way. I mean, that does not say anything against Han Seok-yeon, whose novel is great, but these are texts that are full of puns and of slang and of, well, then again, a language full of pathos. So it's very hybrid in a way. And yeah, I always wanted to be the first who publishes that in a Western language, but somehow it was published in Russian in the same year as mine. It took me very long also to get a publisher for it. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, otherwise, I really, because it's because otherwise it's so sad if nobody asks something. So I just will, I will ask you something in that case. Let me see. What could I ask you? Victoria, what, well, If you go home and somebody is there, let's just assume that, well, and asks you, what did this guy from the Czech Republic or from Austria or wherever talk about? And yeah, anyway, you know that it's not out of real interest. So after one sentence, that person's attention has already expired. What do you say?
Honestly, it got me thinking about literature as something. My world was expanding. So after this lecture, I thought that literature is getting out of that claustrophobic space that maybe data would impose on us, because you said, I mean, at the beginning, the argument was that literature is better for understanding the world or the individual. And I thought that maybe it's a little bit biased if you only read literature. But later in the lecture, you also mentioned that that very fact, and Nabokov's quote about literature not being truth. And in a way, what I got from this lecture is that maybe for a more accurate, holistic view about what is going on in the world would be to combine data and news with literature. And in that way, we can escape the claustrophobic space, because from the stories you told, it was always the question of interior and exterior. Because even though the student was working hard and studying in that small room, so expanding his mind through literature, his outer space was limiting him. So it is crucial that we both look at data and maybe raw facts and literature to understand society and the individual.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I'm especially happy that you said that your world was expanded. That was very nice. Thank you. This saved my day already. Yeah, claustrophobic. That's also a very nice term. I might adopt this. Well, Sasha, Michaela, are you more on the literature serves the self, or rather on the literature, well, is a source of knowledge about the outside world side? On which side are you rather as a reader?
I'm more of on the side of art for the sake of art, but it was interesting the dual point that you made in your presentation, and I was thinking about this, putting those social problems into literature. I don't know, for wanting to escape from them or for exercising them in a sense. And from those examples that you gave us, I felt somehow a sense of magical realism, to say, and it's really interesting, this eschatological type of literature that the Korean novels and short stories are developing. And I was curious if you can, I don't know, explain more about this side.
Eschatological, that's about the last things, right?
I know. I was talking about without the H in the, I mean, about how to put it?
Certification.
Yes.
The scatological.
Sorry. I okay. I tried to strike out the H. Yeah, okay. The scatological. Okay, well, the scatological thing, I mean, that's maybe only anecdotal, but yeah, you may have realized also from watching movies and comedies. I think there is almost no comedy that does without some comic scene involving people's digestion and farting, looing, and well, you know, the big thing. And yeah, that's actually worth thinking about. I think we allowed this in former centuries, and that's maybe also a precarious thing to say. I do not want to imply that we are, so to say, more advanced or so, but I think we have a stricter ban for some reason, or we consider it as too childish to make fun of your about excrements or about farting, or having a scene playing at the toilet with you know, some mishap, or a date being totally destroyed because of the hero's inability to keep anyway, to keep things inside him. But sorry, maybe I'm on the wrong track. You meant this kind of scatological.
Yes, I wanted, like, why are they interested in this? Like, it's some form of expressing the I don't know, some subconscious thoughts or
Subconscious thoughts. Okay. I'd rather say that's within this trend of you know, a mentality that really invites, or that is really very receptive to this kind of humor, and at the same time, I mean, digestion or constipation as a condition that is due to stress, or that is caused through stress. I mean, that's anyway, I think something that is established, but for Browning you in this story, it becomes like a not only a running gag, but really a formula, and more precisely, this dodo who is chased and who became extinct. I mean, one has to consider what is really the tertium comparationis between the precarious worker in Korea and the dodo. It's not that the precarious worker is close to extinction. Yeah, it's only this. This mercilessness of capitalism is sort of compared or set into a relation to to this extinction of the dodo on the one hand, and to this plight of the Korean irregular workers, or workers in general. Not sure whether I hit the point. Thank you. In fact, this story is, Yakult achima. This story is translated into English, and you might. I'm not sure whether it's available online. One or some of those stories that are translated into English, some of those stories by Banmingyu are available online. And there is also a kind of TV drama concocted out of 3 of these stories So you have some very nice images you can associate, and but of course not the absurd things. So the TV drama is quite realistic. So that's maybe the downside thereof. Okay.
Are there any other questions? Or comments? Thank you, Professor Schirmer, for raising our interest in Pag Mingyu's short prose. This is an author we couldn't cover in this class, Modern Korean Literature, for lack of time. So I think it's a very good opening towards a new author for my students. It was very good. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I will be much better when I can teach in person.
Yes.
I believe that, or at least I believe it. So I hope to get an opportunity. But anyway, many thanks for inviting me to this EPEL lecture, Professor Schirmer. And thank you all, especially those who were visible, those who asked questions, responded, but well, everybody, I understand that not everybody can be visible. My students have the same issues. So I try to adapt to it, but it's still really, sometimes it feels like lonely there are types of people who can do that very well, but I am rather of the dialogic kind. Anyway, I hope you took something from it. I think I have to thank for this remark that my world got expanded. That's one of the nicest things that I have heard. In the last. Well, anyway, take it and hello.
Yes, thank you very much. And we are looking forward to having you here in Cluj in person. I hope we can do that in the near future.
Thank you. Okay, I will leave to my next lecture then. And goodbye, everybody. And goodbye, Kodotsa.
Goodbye.